Hello, philosophers. Let's take some time and go through Plato's Apology in a bit of detail because he raises some of the most important and profound questions that philosophers deal with throughout history. Plato, for good reason, is considered the father of Western philosophy. There are very few questions that he doesn't address at some point in his writings. And the Apology is one of the most famous of his writings. As you know, it deals with Socrates' situation before the jury in Athens. So my goal is to highlight some of the key points that I found. Of course, when we get to class, we'll talk about some of the key points that you found, and we'll see together what we can figure out. So first page, which is marked 17, A through E, as you know, we're going to use those page numbers in case we have different versions of the text. Those page numbers will be consistent. So at the beginning, second paragraph, he says, "My accusers, as I maintain, have said little or nothing that is true, but from me you shall hear the whole truth. Not, I can assure you, gentlemen, in flowery language like theirs, decked out with fine words and phrases. No, what you will hear will be improvised thoughts in the first words that occur to me, confident as I am in the justice of my cause." So here we find one of the fundamental distinctions that Plato and Socrates like to make. They think is very important. Here it's articulated as the distinction between pretty language, convincing language, we might call it rhetoric, something like that, the kind of things you see in advertising, of course, in commercials. The distinction between that, which can be very effective and very persuasive, and the truth. Socrates says, "I'm here for the truth, I hope you are too, and I'm not going to dress it up. I'm not going to make it appear any different than what it really is." So on the next page, he makes a similar point about his own speech. He says, "In this present case," this is 18a, "I make this request of you, jurors, which I think is only reasonable, to disregard the manner of my speech, how I speak, my accent, whether or not it sounds intelligent or not, and to consider and concentrate your attention upon this one question, whether my claims are just or not. That is the first duty of the jury, and it is the pleader's, my duty, to speak the truth." So he's warning us from the very beginning that we can be deceived, we could be persuaded by, in this case, flowery language, the way people speak. More generally, we could say, it's the way they appear. So Socrates appears to be telling the truth. People may be persuaded that what he says is the truth. And that appearance can come in the form of language, or it can come in the form of beauty. It could come in the form of a strong personality. Many different forms communication, let's say, can take. All of these, he's saying, are irrelevant. We should just be concerned about the truth. And this, of course, reflects Socrates' career, as he's going to point out again and again. So in sections 18 and 19, he confronts, or at least raises, one of the initial charges against him, the charge that he goes around teaching people that the sun and the moon and the stars are not really divine, not really gods, as the Greeks taught, but are just rocks, in space, something like that. But I want to point out, because this is not a major charge for him really, but I want to point out how this is written and how he expresses it. This is in 18b at the bottom. "There is a clever man called Socrates who has theories about the heavens and has investigated everything below the earth," this is the point I'm focusing on, "and can make the weaker argument defeat the stronger." So here we have another distinction. We've had the distinction between rhetoric and truth, or appearance and reality, say, opinions or appearances and truth. Now we have the distinction between something called a strong argument and a weak argument. That's the charge, that somehow Socrates takes the weak argument and makes it appear strong, or takes the strong argument and makes it appear weak. Socrates does not address this issue head-on right here. He lets it sort of linger in the air. What exactly should it mean that an argument is strong or weak? What makes an argument strong or weak? Socrates has some very definite opinions about this, but it's a distinction that he thinks is important to maintain. Section 20, after he says, I'm really not concerned about the planets and all of that kind of stuff, he introduces us to the first of many, many famous analogies that he uses. This is one of his most popular ways of trying to persuade people and convince people of his point. So he's been accused, as you know, also of teaching the youth the wrong thing, and this would be related to the making of arguments strong and weak. So in section 20 he says, I happened to meet a man who has paid more in sophists' fees than all the rest put together. The sophists comes from wisdom, claim to be wise, and there was a whole industry of educational experts in Athens claiming to be experts in a subject, and so they would be paid very good fees to go around and teach the youth. So Callias had spent lots and lots of money on sophists, and I met him, and he says, I asked him, you have 2 sons. If your sons had been colts or calves, we should have had no difficulty in finding and engaging a trainer to make them excel in the appropriate qualities. And this trainer would have been some sort of horse dealer or agriculturalist. So he's just making the point that in many human areas, animal husbandry, for example, there are people who learn how to train animals well, and we hire them, and they do the job. But seeing that they are human beings, his 2 sons, whom do you intend to get as their instructor? You wouldn't get a horse trainer, right? Who is the expert, Socrates asks, in perfecting the virtues of people in a society? I assume from the fact of your having sons that you must have considered this question. Wouldn't be a very good father if you hadn't, right? Is there such a person or not? Certainly, said Callias. Well, who is he and where does he come from, I said. And what's he charge? Oh, his name is Evenus of Paros, and his fee is 500 drachma. And I felt that Evenus was to be congratulated. If he really was a master of this art of training human beings to be virtuous, and taught it at such a moderate fee, I should certainly become a proud and gentlemanly figure if I understood these things. He's being ironic here, he's being sarcastic. But in fact, gentlemen, I do not understand these things. I've never claimed to know how to train a human being to be a good, virtuous human being. So he uses an analogy here, right? He gets Callias, but also the jurors, to agree with him that in matters of horse training, it's fairly easy to go find an expert and pay them and hopefully be happy with their work. But we're not talking about horses here. We're talking about his 2 sons. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about a much more precious commodity, if you will, resource. Would you not spend even more time looking for the experts to care for your sons, to train them to be virtuous? Well, if so, who do you go to? Who is the expert in the training of people? Socrates is skeptical. But there's a whole industry. swirling around him, claiming to be expert. So in the next section in 21, he anticipates what the jury is thinking. This is still 20, I guess, 20c. And he imagines, he says, you must be thinking this. What is it that you do then, Socrates, if you don't claim any of this? How is it that you have been so misrepresented like this? Surely there's something in your behavior that's abnormal that is causing all of this ruckus and has led you here to this trial. The next paragraph. I have gained this reputation, gentlemen, from nothing more or less than a kind of wisdom. Aha! Aha! We caught you. There you go. You keep saying you don't claim to be wise. Yes, you're admitting it now, right? Wisdom. You're claiming to be wise. That's got you into trouble. Well, what kind of wisdom do I mean, says Socrates. Human wisdom, I suppose. It seems that I really am wise in a very limited sense. Presumably the geniuses whom I just mentioned, these sophists, right, these teachers, are wise in a wisdom that is more than human. I do not know how else to account for it, because I certainly do not have this kind of knowledge, and anyone who says I have is lying and is just saying it to slander me. Now please don't interrupt me, because I have an unimpeachable authority. I shall call as my witness to my wisdom, such that it is, just human wisdom, the god at Delphi. And this is where he launches into his story about, as a young man, going to the temple of Apollo and being told that he was the wisest of all people. So I won't repeat that story. Actually, he doesn't launch into it very much. He says then in 21b, the end of B, he says, after puzzling about this for some time, I set myself at last with considerable reluctance to check the truth of it in the following way. I went to interview a man with a high reputation for wisdom, because I felt that here, if anywhere, I should succeed in disproving the oracle and pointing out to my divine authority, you said I was the wisest, but here's one who's wiser than I am. Notice how he describes the person that he approaches. It's a person of high reputation, right? So if you're going to rely on gossip, if you're going to rely on hearsay, if you're going to rely on people's opinions and attitudes and feelings, you're going to rely on a person's reputation. That's the level at which you're going to approach this question of knowledge, of wisdom. So that's where he begins, where everyone else begins. And he examines the person and he realizes the reputation doesn't match the truth. The person could not give their wisdom in their area of expertise. So he says, I gave a thorough examination to this person. I don't need to mention his name. He was a politician. And in conversation with him, I found the impression that although in many people's opinion, especially his own, he appeared to be wise. Notice all of these impression, opinion, appearance. He's really starting to hammer away at this theme. That it's very possible that we all could be acting and responding to appearances that are false, that don't tell the whole story. He appeared to be wise. In fact, he was not. And so I told myself, well, I'm certainly wiser than this man. This is 21d. Certainly wiser than him. It's likely that neither of us has any knowledge to boast of, but he thinks that he knows something that he does not know, where I'm quite conscious of my ignorance. At any rate, it seems that I'm wiser than he is to this small extent. I don't think I know what I don't know. So he goes around and talks to others, politicians and poets, and he reveals one of the key criteria that he uses to determine whether or not someone has genuine knowledge or wisdom in 22b. He says, I want you to think of my adventures as a cycle of labors undertaken to establish the truth of the oracle once for all. Once I had finished with politicians, I turned to poets, dramatic and lyric and all the rest, in the belief that here I should express myself as a comparative ignoramus. I used to pick up what I thought were some of their most polished works and question them closely about the meaning of what they had written. Well, gentlemen, I hesitate to tell you this, but it must be told. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that any of the bystanders could have explained those poems better than their actual authors. So what are they lacking? And it's not that they can't write good poetry. He doesn't deny that. What he denies is that they understand the source, the origin, the meaning of the poetry. And not of a particular poem so much as how explain to me how your poetry brings about a sense of beauty or joy or pleasure. Explain to me how poetry works. That's what he's asking. You claim to be an expert not in this poem or in that poem. You claim to be an expert in poetry. What is poetry? How does it work? What is it about? And all he gets from these people ultimately is hamana, hamana, hamana. Right? Conversations begin with a great sense of confidence on these people's parts. They're happy to call themselves experts. And they end, one after the other, in what Plato calls, as a Greek term, aporia, which is the kind of breaking down of certainty. A fork in the road, a moment of awareness that one has not reached one's goals and one is confused. All because they can't explain, right? They cannot give an account of what they know, of what they claim to be an expert in. So Socrates then interprets all of these conversations for us in 23a and b. He says, the real truth of the matter, gentlemen, is likely to be this, that the real wisdom is a property of the gods. And that this oracle that I received is a way of telling us, all of us, that human wisdom has little or no value. Remember, he said, I suppose I got into all of this because I have wisdom. What kind? Well, human wisdom. And now he's saying it's of little value. It seems to me that the oracle is not referring literally to Socrates, to me, but has merely taken my name as an example. As if he would say to us, the wisest of you men is he who has realized, like Socrates, that in respect of wisdom, he's really worthless. So he's saying, I'm an everyman. I'm just an average guy. But to say that I'm the wisest is to render human wisdom of little value. That's what I take away from this. All the experts who appear, who sound, who look, who have the reputation, who believe, who think that they're experts, it's only an appearance. It's false. This may be a good point to point out, maybe you've already been recognizing this, that all of this language mirrors very well, doesn't it, the story of the cave. The story of the cave is literally, if you could call a fable, literal, right? It's a story of someone moving from shadows to faint light, to light reflected in the water, to light, right, to the sun. It's the story of a person moving from appearances to reality at different levels. And at every stage, what appears to them seems to be the final truth, but they learn that it's not. And then remember, when the prisoner returns back to the cave, they're confronted with, you might say, a new kind of shadow. Right? And that new kind of shadow is the opinions, the certainty, the arrogance of all the people in the cave who treat him like an idiot because he can no longer see the shadows very well. Right? And they reverse the truth of things out of their ignorance, and they take him to be the fool, the insane person. Well, he knows the truth. So this distinction between truth and appearance, reality and appearance, truth and opinion, has many, many different dimensions. It's not a literal thing, of course, because Socrates is not saying your education as Hawkeye students depends upon your physical eyesight, right? Looking at the sun and all of that. No, of course. What he's saying is your education as Hawkeye students depends upon your intellectual insight. How well you can explain what you know. Your eyes don't help explain what you know. They give you things to see. They don't explain them. Your mind is capable of that. And that's true knowledge, and your mind is subject to many shadows, many falsehoods, many opinions. So the point is not to remove, of course, the physical shadows. It's to remove the mental, intellectual shadows. And those very often have to do with the very things that we began this with. Flowery language, beauty, superficial physical beauty, right? Strong personalities, physical strength, perhaps, persuades. Lots of different social attitudes, reputations, popularity. All of these serve as intellectual shadows, shadows that cover over and obscure and prevent you from seeing the real truth, the explanation behind, right? The origin, the source, the meaning of what you're trying to know, what you're trying to learn. So I hope this gives you a sense of the kind of consistency with which Socrates tells his stories and gives his arguments and does his work, in this case defends himself. He's saying, you all in the jury, you're subject to shadows. You need to pay attention to the truth, not the appearance.